Hello. Hi, friends. So I'm thrilled to be with you virtually, even though I cannot be with you in person. But if there's anything that I know about steampunk, it is that we are resilient creatures and we will prevail and find new ways to share our mutual love of the wondrous and the unexplained. So that's where I come in with the unexplained. So my name is Leanna Renee Heiber. I am an author of 13 novels. Here's my latest baby. There we are. That's my latest baby. So this is a sanctuary of spirits. It's wherever books are sold, or ask for it from your local library. And what I do is I write about ghosts and history, and I'm also a New York City ghost tour guide. So, as a ghost tour guide, when I first came to New York 15 years ago, I knew I wanted to be a tour guide because I knew I wanted to write about New York. And in wanting to write about historic New York, I thought, well, that'll be a great side job to also then be a tour guide because history is my greatest love and interest. So, very quickly, the my interest in ghosts and spooky things. I mean, I'm a lifelong. So these things are all of a piece. So when I took the tour guide's license and the examination, you have to take a test. It's good. I mean, you should be able to tell the difference between the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. New Yorkers like to pretend they know everything. The test kind of proves that you actually do. So in trying to find, okay, well, what's going to be the best way for me to be a tour guide? How am I going to be able to talk about New York in the most passionate way possible? Well, that's definitely by being a ghost tour guide. So I work for a company called Burrows of the Dead. Burrows of the Dead is a woman run company. It's a great company, and we do tours all around the five boroughs. My specialty is, however, in Greenwich Village. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about a couple of my very favorite ghost stories. And then I'm going to share my own personal experiences in each of these haunted houses. So, not only am I going to, talk to you about things that have historic history of haunting, but also my own personal experiences there. So, I'm start off with one of my favorite places, and that is the Merchant's House Museum. So, I'm going to try to get a visual aid here. Hold on. I'm too technologically unsavvy to do a PowerPoint. So you're gonna see, I'm gonna hold up a book, old school, like I like it. So here we go. Here is That's the Merchant's House. It's on 4th Street. So it's south of the Public Theater, just off Lafayette Street. So kind of in the Soho area. So we know now it's a very trendy district, right? Well, in the 1830s, 1832 is when the Treadwell family moved into the Merchant's House. And it's called the Merchant's House because they were a merchant class family. The emerging middle class was a big deal in telling New York's story, especially in the 19th century. So Seabury Treadwell, that was Papa Treadwell's name. And he was kind of an antiquated man. He wore his hair back in a queue, kind of like in the 1700s. So even by 19th century standards, he was a little old school. He was a very stern man, and he ruled his family with a bit of an iron fist. Now, Gertrude Treadwell was the youngest of the daughters that were born in the Merchant's House. And she, much like many women of the day, was expected to be married off, especially with a middle class family like the Treadwells. They wanted to place their daughters in societally advantageous places. So for her, that the pressure was on as the youngest. It was a busy household. There were a lot of people that lived in that house, and Gertrude did find someone she loved, a doctor, and that was that was a suitable profession by this point for a young lady of upwardly mobile family to be interested in. But unfortunately, the family found out and cut off the courtship because the doctor was Catholic and the Treadwells were a very staunch Protestant family. At this point in the 19th century, Catholics and Protestants, there was such a rift, and in many cases around the world, a violent one. Here, it was just never the twain shall meet, certainly not marry. So she lived the rest of her life, not married, and her doctor sweetheart, continued writing letters to each other for the rest of their lives. So while she could have gone on and tried to find someone else, we think maybe those of us who are taken by Gertrude Treadwell and by the Merchant's House itself, we kind of think maybe it was really sort of a one true love kind of scenario because neither one of them married and they did stay in touch. Now, Gertrude was not necessarily alone in the house, even though she was the last of the Treadwell family to live there. But towards the end of her life, she was very lonely. There was just one other person that lived there with her to help with some of the caretaking of the building. She lived there at that address for 93 years, born and died in the same room, 93 years apart. Now, if you think about that, a, a space, a building that has that much of your energy in it. As ghost tour guides, we talk a lot about energy. We talk a lot about psychic imprints, things that have left a certain metaphysical residue on a building, on a place. And we really feel that Gertrude is very much energetically imprinted on the house itself. And whether the house is remembering Gertrude or it's Gertrude that can't, it's hard to know because these two beings, these two entities, a house and its ghost, are completely entwined. In fact, so much so, the myth of Gertrude as this lonely spinster in this aging house, while everything else around her in the block turned more modern. She had ghost stories written about her in the New York Times and other New York papers before she was even dead. She became this almost mythological creature, a spinster behind newspaper covered windows. Now, the only other person that had lived in the house there with her towards the end had been the one that had helped adapt the house in only a couple of ways. So now this was a house from the 1830s, and it was in its heyday in around the 1870s. And it was kept. And we quote from Gertrude, the house was kept exactly as Papa would have liked it. So even though Seabury Treadwell was long gone, he of course died in the house, as was common for many folks in the day. You died in your house, you had a wake, a funeral in your house, in the parlor. That's what you did with many places that were lucky enough to have a parlor. So even though she could have redone the house entirely, she didn't. So still, Seabury Treadwell was kind of exerting influence even long after his passing. The only changes to the house was there was electric light, but the electric light was put into the original gas lamp features. So it's the original features, but with electric bulbs instead. And there was radiator heat put in instead of the fireplaces. The fireplaces were kept. There's still features and fittings of where the fireplaces were and mantles, but radiators went in instead. Those are the only upgrades to the house. So when you wander through the merchant's house and you step into a space that is ice cold and 30 degrees different than your own personal temperature, certainly old houses are drafty, but not that drafty. And there is no air conditioning in that house. One of the many ways in which ghosts like to explore the world of the living is via cold spots. And there are so many cold spots over the course of the several floors of the merchant's house. There have been many sightings of Gertrude, especially if you are there and you have rented the merchant's a bridal shower, a party, perhaps a wedding. It's a gorgeous space to have any sort of celebratory nuptials. Well, always a bridesmaid, never a bride. Poor Gertrude, she's going to show up in your wedding photo. There is always, a lovely display of folks in their regalia, and there on the side is a very distinct human form. So, whether again the house is remembering Gertrude or she is present on the house, there have been many times when people have come to the house and experienced Gertrude in one way or another. And there are other times you can imagine if you're not necessarily sure if your spirit has gone on in this house, it's very clearly her house. And the docents at the museum are very aware of this. It was turned into a museum directly after her death. I'll get to that in a minute. But this is very much her house. And we find this with a lot of, especially sort of feisty, stubborn women of New York that like to stay in their houses. There's several of these kinds of ladies who are just, they have their own way about how they're going to do things in New York, and you are just going to have to deal. You are a visitor in their home. So there was a gentleman who wanted to come to the museum. You have to go up the stairs and ring a bell to be admitted. So he did. And a woman in full Victorian regalia opened the door, and he said that he would love to come in and to see the museum. And she said, "I'm so sorry, we are not accepting visitors today," and closed the door on him. And he thought, all right, there must be an event. Okay, sure. He comes back the next day. He rings the bell. A woman in jeans and a polo shirt answers the door. And he said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're open today. The woman yesterday turned me away. Clearly, there was some event going on." And the docent said, "No, we were open yesterday." And he said, "Well, she was in, full costuming." And the docent said, "But we don't wear costumes." And so the man is getting a little nervous, trying to wonder what happened. So the docent, wanting to make him feel not freaked out, brings him into the house and starts to tell him the story, leads him up the stairwell, and he looks up at a portrait and just goes white as a sheet, white as a ghost, because there he points and stammers out, "That woman, that's who answered the door." It was a portrait, of course, of Gertrude Treadwell. Now, the docent kind of trying to fumble to figure out what to do next for this man who was absolutely terrified by the fact that the ghost had answered the door the day before. She tried to get a little more information out of him. At least maybe this would be good for a story, good for a ghost story. So she asked a little bit more about what Gertrude was wearing. And so the gentleman described the brown taffeta dress that she was wearing, and the docent went into the storeroom where there were many of Gertrude's clothes that were left behind after her death that were not on display. And she pulled out the exact brown taffeta dress that he had seen. Gertrude is very much there, and there are times when she just doesn't necessarily want to be disturbed. Now, Gertrude also, and the other spirits, it's unconfirmed how many spirits wander through the Treadwell home. It's thought that sometimes Seabury Treadwell might be there. Other family members who had lived there for many years. It is a place of ghostly activity. There are a lot of orbs that are captured in photographs. Now, orbs are when you see the lights that are, in a photograph, a circular light. A lot of that can be explained by light refracting off of dust particles, but especially with digital cameras, that's a very different picture these days, as it were. So orbs are very present, and they're still very mysterious. We don't exactly know what causes them, but some sort of light, some sort of read, an energy spectrum, not maybe visible to our eye, but possibly captured in a camera. Again, I mentioned the cold spots. So, my personal experience when I was there taking a tour, and I was in the parlor, the beautiful parlor, it's got red velvet settees, gorgeous furnishings. I highly recommend folks who are interested, who may be listening in or watching this after the fact, please take a virtual tour of the Merchant's House as a part of their ongoing fundraising efforts. They are trying to make the museum accessible to people, offering virtual tours so you can see this place for yourself virtually. So rare to have something from that time period that was a middle class family that's perfectly preserved like a time capsule. So when I was there in the parlor, I was listening to the tour guide talk about how close that building came to demolition, how close that building came to everything in it being sold off. And I just got really verklempt. A family member, a cousin, last minute, when he found out that all of the furnishings were going to be sold off and all of this beautiful time capsule, this was happening. The auction was slated to go forward in the 1930s, right after Gertrude had died. And George Chapman, again, a distant relation, had found out that they were planning to sell everything off, gathered all the money together to buy the house at the very last minute. and kept it and immediately turned it over to the city and opened it within the year as a museum to 19th century life. And the fact that we were so close to losing this precious time capsule, and it's been very important for me as a writer. A lot of the blocking and the houses laid my novels owes a lot to how this house is laid out. Most of my characters are middle class characters trying to find their way, trying to work jobs, and they don't necessarily have huge, fine mansions, but they have, workable New York City brownstones. So this is similar in layout to many things. I turned to the merchant's house as this great resource. So as the tour guide was telling us about this last minute save, I was standing over in the corner of the parlor and I just blurted out because I couldn't help myself. I was very obnoxious. I should have been better as myself a tour guide, that I should have been able to hold my tongue, but I couldn't. I just blurted out, "Oh, thank God it was saved." And as I blurted this out, I was wearing, shorter sleeves, and I felt an ice cold hand grab my elbow in a very distinct little grab, something sort of from behind grabbing my elbow in, sometimes when you can intuit from a touch what the touch means. It wasn't a grab. It wasn't anything that was really meant to scare me. It was an ice cold, friendly touch of commiseration, sort of a, "Oh, it's so lovely that you feel the same way." Now, at first, I thought it was my friend Amanda who I was with, and she has admittedly bad circulation issues. So I thought, maybe it was her cold hand on my elbow. I turned to the side, and it was just the red velvet settee was there. No one was there. But it was a distinct grab and squeeze on my elbow. Commiseration. Someone glad that I felt that same way about the house that they were haunting. So it was a very personal experience. It was actually rather lovely. I admit I'm not someone who's terribly afraid of ghosts. If I was, I'm in the wrong business. So tend to think of ghosts as just energy spectrum that sometimes want to communicate with us. And they may not necessarily be there for anything more than just a passing hello, and then they're off on their own little ghostly business. And who am I to presume what that might be? So I've looked at that as a way of connection. And so I share that with all of my guests. Now, I want to tell you one more ghost story, and then I want to open things up and see if there are any questions that come through. And you'll have to let me know. But I want to talk about 14 West 10th Street because it's a very haunted address. It's thought of as New York's most haunted house, and this one is a little darker. This one is one I don't relish in as much, to tell you the truth. This is one I have a hard time with. The address is joy going past, and I have a hard time talking about it, to tell you the truth, but it is something. When I chose what ghost stories I was going to talk to you about, I wanted ones that I personally had direct and visceral experiences in. So 14 West 10th Street, before I was ever a ghost tour guide, when I just moved to the city around, I wandered by an address and I got a real strong visceral kind of frisson of dislike down my body. It just was this visceral sense of having to just walk away. And later, as I was looking at, reading ghost stories of New York and various books, there are many different books out there. One of my favorites is what I was referring to earlier, Ghosts of New York. This is Susan Blackhall. This has got there's a couple of addresses that don't quite match up with the pictures, but for the most part, her narratives are pretty entertaining. Some of it we have to take with a grain of salt, but in this story, I'll show you the picture of the front of 14 West 10th. When I started doing some research about the area, I thought, oh, 14 West 10th, that's where I felt that really bad negative energy. So I'll admit I'm a bit of an energy sensitive. I can sense if something has a positive or negative energy. I don't presume to say more than that. But here's the address. So it's a brownstone, and the brownstone has a downward entrance. Most of the rest of the addresses on West 10th Street there have stoops that go up, and so you ascend to get to the front door. For 14 West 10th Street, you go down. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, downstairs all good. But the negative energy and the drawing down and the darkness of the portico, it really struck me. Also, an interesting thing in the weathering of the brick. The brick around all of the features of the brownstone there has weathered to black. There's sort of like a black ooze that looks like it has come through the brick. I can't explain it because the other buildings on the block have not weathered like that. They have weathered differently. They've actually more weathered to a sort of a white chalkier substance, not really a black sort of weeping coal out of the eyes of its windows. And so it's very evocative as you're looking at it. And then to hear the stories of the stuff that's happened there is pretty intense. So the building dates back to the 1850s. And we don't really know much about the early life of that building. Psychics who have done reads on the building have thought that there were some early Victorian era abuses, possibly of children, that happened in the house. There have been some psychic reads that have picked up on sort of a history of abuse that had happened in the late 19th century there. Mark Twain, if you pass the building, there's a plaque on the side. Mark Twain lived there for a year. He left after a year saying his wife couldn't keep up with the housework. Now, granted, a full 19th century brownstone, before it was subdivided into many apartments as it is now, there's about 6 apartments in it now. But all of that would have been a lot for, as it was expected for the woman to be the housekeeper and the cleaner. And Twain's finances were a little bit tricky. And so availability to have house staff, not necessarily in the cards for him always. But it's also thought that maybe there was a negativity in the house that drove Twain and his family away too. Because one of our first ghost stories we have is from the 1930s. A woman who had no idea that Twain had lived there saw a figure. She turned around on the stairwell. There was a figure in a white suit with very bushy hair and sort of a small tie, very distinct looking gentleman that said, "My name is Clemens, and there's a score here I've got to settle." Now, Samuel Clemens was Twain's real name, and he was known to kind of be interested in the idea of ghost stories. So this starts us off on a legacy of the building being considered to be haunted. We have an account of all sorts of strange goings on from the 1970s, and it's in a book called Spindrift by Jan Bryant Bartell. So this is Spindrift. Here's Jan Bryant Bartell. She's lovely. May she rest in peace. So Jan Bryant Bartell wrote Spindrift while she was living at 14 West 10th Street. She would talk about how there was this miasma that would come through the wall, sort of this black cloud, much like what I sort of described, kind of feels like it's coming out of the bricks, in just sort of this black stain. For her, it would move. It moved from the address next door and in through the wall into 14 West 10th. Not only did she notice this, but the minute that she moved into 14 West 10th, she herself being a bit sensitive, so was her beloved dog, Penelope, who started barking at the wall, frothing at the mouth, and died of a heart attack within the first week that they got into the building. She then began to chronicle her own kind of mental unraveling, as well as other issues in the house. She recorded over death in the house. Now, again, 5 or 6 apartments is all that this building has. Over the course of several years, about a decade that she lived there, 24 or so deaths, either heart attacks, drug overdoses, suicides, other sudden, unexpected, or terminal illnesses. That's a lot. The caretakers through the years have just given up, saying that the building is cursed. It hasn't been fully rented out, and any of them since I've come to New York, it hasn't been fully rented out. There's whole darkened places. There are some people that live there, so if you do go by this address, please respect this is a residential area and people do live in the building, not many. And certainly the realtors don't, advertise any of this. This is all just lore. If you look up the address, it comes up a lot. So she is talking about all of these various seances. Jan Bryant Bartell, she has seances in the house. Um, she basically tries to kind of figure things out. And again, that's where we get the idea of some other negative things that happened as sort of a template in the house, that maybe the house just kind of keeps perpetuating a certain amount of negative energy. Several times, a woman all in gray with a gray cat has said everything's fine, which of course sounds absolutely suspicious and not at all true. Now we get to 1980. See, Jan Bryant Bartell leaves. She leaves. She finally has enough of the house. This narrative, again, this is an out of print book. This is an out of print book, so you can't actually find it in print anymore. Not many were ever printed. And it was actually published posthumously. She left the house, finally got free of it, and died of a heart attack within the next year. Her husband writes in the postscript here about that, the idea of the house kind of having the last word. It kind of got her in the end. So this narrative doesn't get to 1980. 1980, a new horror happens in the house. The Steinberg family moves in. Now, any New Yorker or surrounding environs that were around and paying attention to the news in 1980, anytime I'm giving this tour, this is when old New Yorkers or longtime New Yorkers gasp, because that name rings a strong bell with them, and they didn't put it together with this house. But Joel Steinberg was a lawyer. His partner Nessa was a children's book illustrator. So these were smart, intelligent people. Off the books, they adopted, so illegally adopted two children, a little boy and a 9-year-old girl named Lisa. When Joel Steinberg moved into the house, his friends during the trial of the Steinbergs moved in. When he moved in, they said that he started to devolve. He was addicted to substances and he would go on these sort of drug fueled rages. And during one of them, he had begun hitting and being abusive to Nessa and the children. And he did strike Lisa with a pipe, and she was let to die in the bathroom and bled out there. And so during the murder trial, he basically said he didn't know what came over him. Friends said that everything changed when he moved into that house. So it's almost something right out of The Shining. And so the negative energy of this house that had this sort of ongoing history of troubles, for then to have this very sensational New York City trial associated with it was a lot. And so these are the things we talk about when we pass this address. Personally, as someone who's an energy sensitive, I am very short of breath when I stand out in front of it. There's an oppressive air about that place, and it's definitely something that Jan Bryant Bartell talked about when she lived in it. So it's one that has inspired several scenes in some of my novels about an evil house. I used it in my Eterna Files series because I needed to have a disaster that took place in a building, and my psychics needed to come and something terrible had happened, and a mystery unfolds from that house that's still carrying that horror in its walls, in its bricks. So I try to use things like this, especially ones that I can't quite get my head around, and that and certainly that unsettle me. I try to think, well, how can I use that? How can that be something that I can be aware of? How can I try to use this as inspiration and maybe make a point of resolution? Because for me, I love to have resolution. I sort of like to solve the mystery. And with a lot of things about being a ghost tour guide, there's just ongoing mysteries. We will never really understand what's happened with that house or why it continues to be such a problematic address. So that's been the interesting thing for me about being a ghost tour guide, is that folks come to me, and I didn't realize that I would be sort of supernatural chaplain in a way, that folks would want to come to me with their own personal ghost stories of the things that had happened to them or the things that were inexplicable. And so I love to talk with people about their own experiences. And I get asked all the time, do I believe in the paranormal and what I think about all of. And I share with them that I am a skeptic first, but I'm a believer entirely because I like to rule things out in terms of a certain amount of skepticism. I don't want to just go running in blindly to things. We try as tour guides to rule out things that have been proven to just be tall tales. Um, and we certainly like to talk about the things that we ourselves have experienced because, much like anything that is perception based, it's just that, it's perception, and perception changes for everybody. Just like spirituality, it's very private and it's very personal. And it's not really anybody's business necessarily, one way or another, about how you relate to your own divine or not. So I try never to sort of say, well, this is the way it is, but I definitely try to say what my experiences are. And I try to validate what theirs are, whether they're adamant skeptics and are just in it for the history and the strange stories that have unfolded from these places. And if they take them just as fictions, that's fine with me. I don't need to convince anybody. I've had enough weird things happen that I don't have to convince anybody. So I want to try to leave things a little bit open to if there's comments or questions. I'm not sure exactly how that's gonna come through the channel, so I don't know if I'm gonna see a chat bubble pop up. I should also say, before, I get too far off track, where you can find me, because if I can't get to a question that anyone has now, I'm an open book about all these kinds of things, and whether I can answer it or someone from Burrows of the Dead can answer it for you in terms of haunted New York. You can find me on Twitter at Leanna Renee, LeannaRenee. And I have a Facebook author page, but I'm never on Facebook, so you're probably not gonna find me there. You can find me at all three of my names, Leanna Renee Heiber. That's my Instagram, is all three names. Also, leannareneheiber.com. That's my website where you can find information about all of my books, all of which have ghosts in them. And a lot of the themes that I talk about in my discussions about the ghostly factor into my work as well. And I'm always happy to answer questions that way. Also, because this is in lieu of what we would be doing in person, I definitely invite you to my my Etsy store. It's called Torch and Arrow. So it's Etsy shop slash Torch and Arrow all together. There you can find cool Gothic neo jewelry, few vintage pieces and do new things with them. My business partner, Tom Truelove, is also a sculptor and an artist. And together we created Pandora's Pets, which are little creatures that are designed to eat worry that you have. And they will take care of the worry for you by eating it. And they're very cute and animate little creatures. They're sculpted out of polymer clay, finished with paint and love. And we can custom make them to be sculpted towards whatever emotional quality that you would like to uh, evoke from them, that you would like to get support for from them. So check out our Etsy, because we would love to have been there in person with you this weekend. Our wares, the Etsy is one of the ways we're keeping our lights on right now. You can find all my books there. You can get a signed copy of my books there as well. And also, if you look up Tom Truelove on Facebook, it's a pretty distinct name. You can chat with him also about all of his really cool digital art that he does as well. So, if there is a way to answer questions, I will be happy to answer questions. If questions are not coming through, what I will continue to do, as I know that this is going to be also put onto the website, I'll tell you another one of my ghost stories, one of my favorite ghost stories. I have to mention my favorite and most thrilling night in Salem, Massachusetts. And of course, Salem, Massachusetts, right? Of course, everyone thinks, oh, it's got to be haunted. Yes, quite truly it is. And I was at the Hawthorne Hotel. The Hawthorne Hotel was built in the 20s. Big, beautiful luxury hotel in Salem. And I was on the 6th floor in room 606. auspicious numbers, right? Well, it was 3 in the morning when I woke up out of a dead sleep, 3 in the morning. Those of you who tend to know the time frame of the witching hour will know that is in fact the witching hour. Many people think that midnight is the witching hour. No, in fact, it's 3 a.m. That is the time in which most paranormal activity tends to be recorded or experienced. So, 3 a.m., I'm awoken from a dead sleep and I hear a strange noise and it's coming up and down the hallway. A jingling of keys. Now, we as people, we know the sound of a jingling of a whole bunch of keys. It's a very distinct sound. And it was going up and down the hallway. But then it occurred to me, I began to process several different aspects of this sound slowly because, again, I'd woken up out of a dead sleep. So, as this sound is pacing the hallway, I'm putting together that while I'm hearing jingling keys, they sound far away, almost as if they're through glass. And so I'm listening. And I then realize that there's no footsteps attached. There's just the jingling of keys. And then I think, well, why would anyone have their keys out at all? The Hawthorne Hotel is key card entry now. No one uses a key to get into their rooms. So then, of course, me being a ghost guide and a ghostly being, ghosts are kind of my thing. I do jump to those conclusions rather quickly, I will admit. I think, well, maybe it's the ghost of a caretaker, someone who is here in the 1920s with that keys. That's the only thing that would make sense. Surely it's a caretaker who is wandering their floor on their shift. And so, as I'm thinking this and putting this together, surely I am hearing a clairaudient haunting. Now, that's a haunting that you hear. So, clairvoyant, if you are clairvoyant, you see something, whether a vision or you're seeing something. Clairaudient, meaning it's a haunting that you hear. So, I was having a clairaudient haunting of the help. And so, as this sound gets closer to the door, there's a quiet moment. And just as I'm proud of myself for thinking that I've solved the mystery, that I'm having this clairaudient haunting that I'll be able to talk about on future discussions of the paranormal, the sound pauses. And then the next sound I hear is a fingernail scratch on the headboard above my head, 3 inches from my face. We all know the sound of a fingernail on wood. It is just as distinct of a sound as the jingling of keys. Now, I say I'm not afraid of ghosts, but this one was a little close for comfort. So, oh my goodness. I thought to myself, what do I do in this moment? And I thought, okay, Leanna, what's your training? My training is that I think that ghosts just want to be acknowledged, especially ghosts who were in, routine service industries. They're going to want, like anybody would want, some recognition. So I blurted to the room, thank you for all of your help and all of your service through all of these years. This room is lovely. Thank you. Pause. Jingle, 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 and the jingling of keys continues out down the hallway and does not resume again. So, that's my lesson for you, is that when you're in a situation where a ghost wants to be acknowledged, acknowledge the ghost. Maybe thank it for something and cross your fingers and hope that it won't get that close to you ever again, because that was a bit much. So, everyone has a story. That's the interesting thing to me about why ghost stories are very important, because it's something that everybody has some kind of relationship to, even if you yourself have never had a ghost story per se. You know someone who has. There's some urban legend in your hometown. There's some sort of and especially there's usually somebody who is absolute avowed skeptic, and yet there's this one thing that happened that they can't explain. And a lot of times people don't wanna talk about it. Ghosts are funny that way. It's like it either gets people to open up or absolutely clam up, and they want nothing to do with it. And maybe they could be aware of these various things if they wanted to, but they've shut all that down, and I respect that, totally do. But ghosts, unlike other supernatural creatures, ghosts are of us. They are of us. They could be our loved ones. They could be people we know. We don't know. It's there. It's so close to us, unlike other creatures. I mean, you may know some vampires. I mean, I'm a goth, you know. You may know some, maybe know some werewolves. I don't know, but for the most part, ghosts are the most likely to be relational to us somehow, and that therein makes it both alien and also appealing. So ghosts become a funny dichotomy that way. So, in all of that, if you are somewhere on the fence about ghosts, well, don't worry, you're in good company. The folks who come on our tours are very much all of a stripe. We are doing, I will say, as a plug for our company, we are doing some virtual ghost tours. We usually start back up here in spring and early summer. Obviously, we do most of our business in the fall, most interested in spooky things. But we do have some virtual tours that are happening. And so, what we'll be doing is showing some sort of a PowerPoint slideshow of some of the various locations and talking about them with you and sort of guiding you through. So, do check out Burrows of the Dead. That's our company, and let us know if there's something you'd like to see. We're going to have several ones scheduled. I have one upcoming in June about the magic and mysticism of Central Park. It's not really a ghost tour per se. It's more about how thinking, mystical thinking, and other alternative and esoteric ways of thought helped birth the need for Central Park and the energies and the beautiful places and the mysterious little things that are inside the park. So I'll be leading that as well. So check us out there. Um, I hope that you'll continue to stick around for all the other great steampunk offerings. I'm so thrilled to see friends and music that I love, and to kind of have some sort of sense of community here online, even though we can't be all together in person. So don't be a stranger. Again, LeannaReneeHeiber.com is my website. For those of you who are interested in becoming a writer, I do have a writer's guide on my website. What's listed there is everything that was helpful to me when I was first starting out as a writer. Every writer's process and journey is completely different and unique, but I'm happy to share the things that were helpful to me as I was starting out. So if you go onto my free reads page, which does have free reads, I even have a free ghost story up there. In fact, there's a couple. So check those out. And then on that free reads page, you'll find So You Want to Be a Writer, and that's my writer's guide. You'll also find that on the contact page. There's a link to that blog as well that has everything listed that I found helpful, the organizations that were helpful to me starting out too. And then also that's the contact page. If you do have other questions that come up, whether you're watching this now or watching this later, feel free to ask. So don't be a stranger even on the virtual internets. So I want to thank Diana and everybody who's been a part of getting this going so that we can have something that has made this feel a little bit like home. And I want to thank all of you for being a part of the steampunk community. And if steampunk is new to you, well, welcome. Steampunk is a welcoming community of looking at innovation and ways to make history accessible and reinvented. So, welcome. Ask us questions. We're a pretty cool crew. So, I want to thank everybody. And again, I hope to see you around. Happy haunting.